A quiet morning walk takes a shocking turn when a loyal dog returns home with a mysterious key tied with a red ribbon. At first, it seems like nothing more than a strange trinket, until a vet recognizes it as part of a long-forgotten town legend. But this isn't just about a key. It's about an ancient fortune, a legacy of betrayal, and a secret that could tear a small town apart. What happens when history resurfaces, greed takes over, and a quiet widow finds herself at the center of it all? This story will leave you breathless as a community unravels, all because of one strange object carried home by a dog. Don't miss the twists, the heartbreak, and the ultimate redemption that will change this town forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn morning wrapped around Claire Benson like a familiar blanket as she walked through the woods, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. Her German shepherd, Max, trotted faithfully beside her, his warm presence a small comfort in the stillness of her daily routine. The damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air with that distinct October smell she used to love sharing with Tom. 2 years. The thought made her chest tighten. 2 years since she'd lost him, and still the silence in her life felt deafening. Claire pulled her jacket closer, watching her breath form little clouds in the crisp air. "At least I have you, buddy," she said softly, reaching down to scratch Max's ears. The big dog leaned into her touch, his tail wagging gently. They continued along their usual trail, the one they'd walked hundreds of times before. The morning sun filtered through the nearly bare branches, creating dancing shadows on the path. Claire was lost in thought when Max suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears shot up and his body went rigid. Before Claire could grab his collar, he bolted into the underbrush. "Max!" she called out anxiously, her heart jumping. "Max, come back!" Branches rustled and leaves crackled as Max crashed through the undergrowth. Claire stood rooted to the spot, straining to follow the sound of his movement. After a moment that felt much longer than it was, she heard him returning. Max emerged from the bushes with his head held high, obviously proud of himself. Something dangled from his mouth, catching the morning light. "What have you got there?" Claire knelt down as Max dropped his prize into her waiting hand. "Oh my!" It was a key, old and weathered, with intricate patterns carved into its surface. A faded red ribbon, frayed at the edges, but still holding its knot, was tied through the loop at the top. Claire turned it over in her palm, studying the unusual design. "Now where did this come from?" she wondered aloud, brushing away a bit of dirt. The metal was dark with age, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Someone must have dropped it while walking through here. Max sat beside her, tail sweeping the ground as she examined his find. Claire slipped the key into her jacket pocket, patting it securely. Later that evening, in the quiet of her kitchen, Claire set the mysterious key on her table. The overhead light caught the worn metal and dusty ribbon, making them seem to glow with an odd importance. She studied it for a long moment, an inexplicable feeling tugging at her mind. But she shook her head at her own fanciful thoughts. The next morning dawned bright and clear as Claire guided Max through the glass doors of Pinewood Hollow Veterinary Clinic. The waiting room felt warm and welcoming, with sunlight streaming through the large windows and catching the dust motes dancing in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Benson." The receptionist's cheerful voice greeted them. "Dr. Miller will be with you shortly." Claire settled into one of the cushioned chairs, Max sitting obediently at her feet. She absently stroked his fur while flipping through an old magazine, though her mind kept drifting to the mysterious key in her pocket. "Claire, Max, come on back." Dr. Grace Miller appeared in the doorway, her kind face creased in a familiar smile. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her blue scrubs had tiny paw prints scattered across them. In the examination room, Grace ran her hands expertly over Mac's muscular frame. "What brings you two in today?" "Yesterday in the woods, Max ran off suddenly," Claire explained, watching as Grace checked Mac's legs. "He found something, actually, and I wanted to make sure he hadn't hurt himself while searching for it." Grace looked up with interest. "Oh, what did he find?" Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out the key with its faded red ribbon. "This old key? It seems so out of place in the woods." Grace straightened up, wiping her hands on a paper towel before taking the key. Her brow furrowed as she turned it over in her hands, studying the ribbon with particular interest. "You know," she said slowly, "this ribbon looks familiar. I've seen something similar in the artifact catalog at the Pinewood Hollow Historical Museum." She handed the key back to Claire. "They have a whole section dedicated to local historical items. You might want to take it there. They could tell you more about where it came from." The museum. Claire hadn't visited in years, not since taking her art students there on a field trip. "I hadn't thought of that." "Max is perfectly fine, by the way," Grace added with a smile, giving the dog an affectionate pat. "Whatever adventure he went on yesterday didn't cause any harm." Claire thanked Grace and settled the bill at the front desk. Standing outside the clinic in the morning sunshine, she held up the key, watching how the light played across its weathered surface. The museum might hold some answers, she thought, deciding to stop by later that afternoon. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the museum's tall windows as Claire and Grace stepped into the hushed interior of the Pinewood Hollow Historical Museum. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood brought back memories of Claire's visits years ago. Display cases lined the walls, filled with artifacts that told the town's story. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a silver-haired woman with bright, intelligent eyes, looked up from her desk near the entrance. "Dr. Miller, what a pleasant surprise." She adjusted her reading glasses, smiling warmly at them both. "Mrs. Carter, this is Claire Benson," Grace said. "We have something interesting to show you." Claire stepped forward, carefully retrieving the key from her pocket. "My dog Max found this in the woods yesterday morning." She described the discovery, watching Mrs. Carter's expression change from polite interest to wide-eyed amazement as she held out the key. Mrs. Carter's hands trembled slightly as she took the key, examining it with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades handling historical artifacts. "I can hardly believe it," she whispered. "This matches the exact description of Edward Calloway's key." She hurried to a nearby display case, unlocking it with practiced efficiency. From inside, she pulled out a leather-bound diary, its pages yellow with age. "Edward Calloway was our town's first blacksmith," she explained, carefully turning the brittle pages. "But he was more than that. He was a philanthropist who devoted his life to helping others, particularly those who faced discrimination and hardship." Finding the page she wanted, Mrs. Carter pointed to a specific entry. "Here, he describes a key, bound with a red ribbon, that would unlock a chest he had hidden away. According to local legend, the chest contained wealth meant to support marginalized communities in Pinewood Hollow." Claire leaned in to look at the careful handwriting. The ink faded, but still legible. Grace joined them, peering over their shoulders at the diary. "So this key," Claire said slowly, "might actually lead to something important?" Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. "If this is truly Calloway's key, it could be connected to a treasure that's been lost to history for over a century." As they prepared to leave the museum, Claire felt the weight of the key in her pocket more keenly than before. Standing on the museum steps with Grace, she shook her head in disbelief. "A hidden chest of wealth," she muttered. "Why would Max find something like this in the woods?" The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Claire made her way back to the museum. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as she entered, finding Mrs. Carter arranging some old photographs in a display case. I had a feeling you might return, Mrs. Carter said with a knowing smile. She gestured toward 2 comfortable chairs near her desk. Please sit. I can tell you have questions about Edward Calloway. Claire settled into the chair, pulling the key from her pocket. I can't stop thinking about him. What happened to make him hide his wealth? Mrs. Carter's eyes grew distant as she began her tale. Edward Calloway wasn't just a blacksmith. He was the heart of Pinewood Hollow. He helped build this town from nothing, using his skills to assist anyone in need. Never charged the poor a penny for his work. She pulled out a faded photograph showing a tall man with kind eyes standing proudly in front of his shop. But success breeds jealousy, Mrs. Carter continued, her voice growing softer. 3 of his closest friends, men he'd helped establish their own businesses, turned on him. They spread rumors about him cheating customers, about his wealth being ill-gotten. They wanted his money and his land. Claire felt her throat tighten. The betrayal reminded her of losing friends after her husband's death, when some had shown their true colors during the estate settlement. Calloway knew what they were planning, Mrs. Carter said, carefully turning the pages of his diary. So he converted his wealth and hid it away. His last diary entry mentions wanting it to help those truly in need, not those consumed by greed. What happened to him? Claire asked, leaning forward. He died alone in his home, never revealing the location. Those 3 men searched for years but found nothing. The chest became our town's greatest mystery. Claire ran her thumb over the key's worn surface. And no one ever found any clues? Just stories and rumors. Some say he hid hints throughout the town, but nothing's ever been proven. Standing up, Claire tucked the key back into her pocket. Her mind was already racing with possibilities. If this key truly belonged to Calloway's chest, perhaps she could finish what he started, help their community the way he'd wanted. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, she said. I think I need to look into this further. Walking back through town, Claire observed the old buildings with new eyes. Somewhere in this place, Calloway had left his legacy. She felt a growing determination to uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for the man who'd wanted to make a difference. The evening settled over Pinewood Hollow as Claire welcomed her friends into her living room. The fireplace cast a warm glow across their faces, while Max lounged contentedly at their feet. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she held up the antique key. I know this might sound incredible, she began, but this key could be connected to Edward Calloway's lost chest. She carefully passed the key around, watching their expressions. Grace leaned forward eagerly. The craftsmanship is remarkable. And that red ribbon, it matches perfectly with the museum records. Nancy adjusted her reading glasses, studying the key with narrowed eyes. It's certainly old enough, she admitted. But Claire, dear, are you sure you want to pursue this? Treasure hunts have a way of stirring up trouble. I'm not after treasure, Claire explained. I want to understand what happened. Maybe even finish what Calloway started, helping the community. That's exactly what this town needs, Grace exclaimed. Think of the good we could do if we found it. The discussion grew animated. Grace suggested checking Old Town records, while Nancy pointed out potential complications. No, people might get the wrong idea, she warned. You know how rumors spread here. As if on cue, Claire noticed movement outside her window. Several neighbors walking past, glancing at her house with obvious curiosity. The news was already traveling. Later, while collecting coffee cups from the side table, Claire heard voices drift through her partially open window. Did you hear about Claire Benson? She's convinced she found some old key to hidden riches, one voice said. Poor thing, another replied. Ever since Tom passed, she's been different. Maybe she just needs something to keep her busy. Or maybe she's after the money. Widow's pension only goes so far these days. Claire's hands stilled on the cups, her chest tightening at their words. She glanced at the key sitting on her mantel, its worn surface catching the firelight. Settling into her armchair, she picked it up, running her finger along its intricate pattern. The neighbor's whispers echoed in her mind, making her question everything. Was she fooling herself? Was this just a desperate attempt to find meaning after Tom's death? But as she sat there, watching the flames dance in her fireplace, Claire felt something stronger than doubt stirring in her heart. Determination. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves as Claire pulled on her walking boots. Her mind kept circling back to the whispered doubts she'd overheard. But the familiar routine of preparing for their morning walk brought comfort. Max wagged his tail eagerly, sensing they were about to head out. "At least you believe in me, don't you, boy?" Claire scratched behind his ears, managing a small smile. The woods welcomed them with a symphony of rustling leaves and birdsong. Claire breathed in deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. The familiar path stretched before them, decorated with fallen leaves in brilliant shades of red and gold. Max trotted beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Suddenly, Max's demeanor changed. His ears perked up, and he began pulling on his leash with unusual intensity. His sharp bark echoed through the trees. "What is it, Max?" Claire stumbled slightly as he tugged her off their usual trail. She trusted his instincts enough to follow, though the underbrush grew thicker with each step. They pushed through a tangle of branches, and Claire found herself on what appeared to be an old, forgotten path. Vegetation had nearly reclaimed it, but there was still a subtle depression in the earth where people had once walked regularly. "I've never noticed this before," Claire murmured, brushing aside some vines. That's when she saw them. The carvings. They were weathered but distinct, etched into the bark of several old oak trees. Some resembled arrows, others looked like symbols she didn't recognize. Claire pulled out her phone, her hands slightly shaking with excitement as she photographed each marking. "These can't be random," she whispered, moving from tree to tree. The carvings seemed to follow a pattern, spaced deliberately along the hidden trail. Max continued sniffing the ground intently, his tail wagging with enthusiasm. He moved purposefully between the marked trees, as if following an invisible trail that only he could detect. "You really think we're onto something, don't you?" Claire asked, watching his confident movements. His excitement was contagious, pushing away her earlier doubts. Back home, Claire sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the photos on her phone. The morning light streamed through her window as she studied each carving carefully. Max lay at her feet, content but alert. "We need to learn more about these," she said, gathering her things for a trip to the library. The mystery of the carvings had given her a new focus, something tangible to pursue. Whatever doubts she'd harbored earlier that morning had been replaced by determination. Claire pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the Pinewood Hollow Library, breathing in the familiar scent of aged paper and polished oak. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches on the worn carpet. Behind the front desk, Mrs. Martha Collins looked up from her computer and smiled warmly. "Claire, it's wonderful to see you," Mrs. Collins said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You look like you're on a mission." "I am, actually." Claire pulled out her phone. "I need to look at some historical maps of the town. Would you be able to help me?" Mrs. Collins' eyes lit up. "Of course. The historical section is my specialty. Follow me." They walked past rows of shelves to a quiet corner where large map drawers lined the wall. Mrs. Collins pulled out several yellowed maps with careful hands, laying them on a broad wooden table. "These date back to the town's founding," she explained, smoothing the edges of a particularly detailed map. "What exactly are you looking for?" Claire showed her the photos of the carved trees. I found these markings in the woods this morning. They seem intentional, like they're marking a path. Mrs. Collins leaned in, squinting at the images. She traced her finger along the old map, comparing the locations. "Look here," she said, tapping a spot on the map. "These markings, they seem to align with these old paths leading to Calloway's forge." "The blacksmith's forge?" Claire's heart beat faster. "Yes." Mrs. Collins nodded, pulling out another map. "The forge was once the heart of our town. Everyone gathered there. It wasn't just for metalwork. Calloway made it a meeting place, a community center of sorts." She sighed. "After his death, it fell into ruin. Such a shame." Claire studied the maps intently, noting how the carved symbols corresponded with the old walking paths. "What happened to the forge building?" "It's still standing, barely, but there's more to it than meets the eye." Mrs. Collins lowered her voice. "There have always been rumors about hidden passageways beneath the forge, underground rooms where Calloway might have kept important things safe." Claire's fingers traced the path on the map leading to the forge. "Do you think anyone's ever investigated these passages?" "If they have, they've kept quiet about it." Mrs. Collins straightened some papers. "The forge has been abandoned for so long, most people avoid it altogether." Claire carefully photographed the relevant maps and made detailed notes about the locations. The afternoon light was growing dim by the time she gathered her materials, her mind already planning a visit to the forge the next morning. The old forge loomed before Claire in the early morning light, its stone walls wrapped in thick ivy like green fingers clutching at the past. Max padded quietly beside her, his breath visible in the crisp air. The building's broken windows stared like empty eyes, and fallen leaves scattered across the worn path leading to the entrance. "Well, here we go, boy," Claire whispered, patting Max's head. Inside, the forge was eerily silent. Dust motes danced in thin beams of sunlight that pierced through gaps in the roof. Old tools hung from rusty hooks, and a massive stone hearth dominated one wall, its chimney reaching up into shadows. Claire moved carefully across the uneven floor, studying the ground. Near an old workbench, she noticed familiar markings etched into the stone floor, similar to the tree carvings she'd found in the woods. Max suddenly perked up, his nose working overtime. He trotted to a spot near the base of the workbench and began pawing at the floorboards, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Claire knelt beside him, running her hands over the worn wood. Her fingers caught on a slight groove, and her heart jumped. Working quickly but carefully, she dug at the edges with her fingers, lifting away years of dirt and grime. The floorboard came loose, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Claire's hands trembled as she reached inside and pulled out a chest, its metal surface dulled with age. Her breath caught in her throat as she retrieved the key from her pocket, the very one Max had found in the woods. The key slid into the lock perfectly. With a deep breath, Claire turned it, hearing a satisfying click. The lid creaked as she lifted it, but her excitement turned to momentary disappointment when she saw the chest wasn't filled with treasure. Instead, she found only 2 items, a delicate, aged map and a leather-bound ledger. Carefully lifting out the ledger, Claire opened its fragile pages. Names filled the yellowed paper, arranged in neat columns with dates and notes beside them. "Samuel Thompson, Tools for New Farm," she read softly. "Mary Wilson, Medicine for Children." The list went on, each entry a record of Calloway's generosity. The map was even more intriguing, its faded lines showing what appeared to be another location marked with an X. Claire couldn't quite make out where it led, but she knew someone who might help. "Come on, Max," she said, gently wrapping the items in her scarf and tucking them safely in her bag. "We need to show these to Mrs. Carter." The morning sun streamed through the museum's tall windows as Claire carefully placed the map and ledger on the archive room's polished oak table. Mrs. Carter's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as she slipped on her white cotton gloves to examine the artifacts. "This is extraordinary, Claire," Mrs. Carter said, gently unfolding the aged map. The paper crackled softly under her careful touch. "Look at the detail in these markings." Claire leaned in closer, watching as Mrs. Carter traced the faded lines with her gloved finger. The map showed familiar landmarks: the river, the old church steeple, and winding paths through what was once a smaller pinewood hollow. "Here's where we are now," Mrs. Carter pointed to a spot on the map. "And here's the forge where you found these items." Her finger slid across the paper to a heavily marked area. "But this spot here, this is what interests me most." Claire studied the location. "What's there now?" "That area is deep in the woods, probably 2 or 3 miles past the forge. It's completely overgrown these days. Barely anyone goes out there anymore." Mrs. Carter reached for the ledger next, handling its worn leather cover with reverence. As they flipped through the pages, Mrs. Carter's expression grew more animated. "Claire, these names, I recognize so many of them. Look here, Thompson, medical care provided. That would be Jenny Thompson's great-grandfather. And here, Martinez family, winter provisions. That's absolutely Miguel Martinez's ancestors." Claire's eyes widened as she recognized more names. "There must be dozens of current residents with family connections here." Mrs. Carter's face grew serious. This could cause quite a stir in town. Some people might not want these records public, especially those whose ancestors opposed Callaway. And others might feel entitled to whatever we might find, because their families are listed here. Claire nodded thoughtfully, understanding the delicate situation. "But this is part of our town's history. Surely that matters." "It does," Mrs. Carter agreed, carefully closing the ledger. "But history can be a powerful thing, Claire. It can unite people, or divide them." Standing up, Claire gathered the items carefully. "Then we'll need to handle this the right way. We'll need help to explore that location in the woods, and maybe this is a chance to bring people together instead of pulling them apart." Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. "That sounds like something Edward Callaway himself might have said." The community center buzzed with conversation as Claire stood at the front, her hands trembling slightly as she held the map and ledger. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the metal folding chairs creaked as residents settled in their seats. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from Grace's encouraging smile in the front row. "Thank you all for coming," Claire began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've discovered something important about our town's history." She held up the weathered items. "This map and ledger belong to Edward Callaway." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Claire explained her findings. She described Mac's discovery of the key, the hidden chest at the forge, and the names in the ledger. Some residents leaned forward with interest, while others crossed their arms skeptically. "Many of your ancestors' names are in this ledger," Claire said, carefully turning the delicate pages. "Callaway helped so many families in our community." From the back of the room, Charles Whitman stood up, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of other attendees. "This is nonsense," he declared, his voice carrying authority. "That land has belonged to my family for generations. We have the deeds to prove it." "But the map clearly shows," Claire started. "The map shows nothing but an old man's fantasies," Whitman interrupted. "We can't allow trespassers digging up private property based on some wild treasure hunt." The room erupted in heated discussion. Mrs. Thompson, whose ancestor's name appeared in the ledger, stood up. "I think we should hear Claire out. This is our history, too." Others voiced agreement, while some sided with Whitman. Claire watched as invisible lines divided the room, neighbor from neighbor. Her confidence wavered as the debate grew more intense. Grace stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Claire's shoulder. "Maybe we should focus on what this means for our community," she suggested loudly, trying to calm the tension. "This isn't just about property, it's about our shared heritage." The meeting ended with unresolved arguments hanging in the air. Claire stepped out into the night, the cool breeze a relief after the heated atmosphere inside. Her hand still clutched the map and ledger as Grace joined her outside. "Don't let them discourage you," Grace said softly. "You saw how many people support what you're doing. This matters to them, too." Claire nodded, looking up at the stars twinkling above Pinewood Hollow. Despite her shaken confidence, she felt the truth of Grace's words. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The morning sun filtered through Claire's kitchen windows as she spread the old map across her dining table. Grace and Nancy leaned in, studying the faded markings, while Max sat alertly nearby, his tail thumping against the floor. "The spot seems to be about 2 miles into the woods," Claire explained, tracing the path with her finger. "Past the old creek bed." Nancy adjusted her reading glasses, her expression thoughtful. "I used to play in those woods as a kid. It's pretty overgrown now, but I might recognize some landmarks." "I brought some water and snacks," Grace added, patting her backpack. "And I marked the museum's copy of the map with GPS coordinates, just in case." They set out along the forest trail, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. Max took the lead, his nose working overtime as he guided them deeper into the woods. The morning air was crisp, and patches of sunlight danced through the canopy above. "Look there!" Claire pointed to a tree trunk. Another carving, similar to the ones they'd found before, was etched into the bark. The symbol, though weathered, was unmistakable. "It matches the ones from the forge trail," Grace confirmed, snapping a photo with her phone. As they pressed on, more carvings appeared, creating a breadcrumb trail through the dense forest. Nancy's knowledge proved valuable as she helped them navigate around thorny thickets and over fallen logs. After an hour of hiking, the trees opened into a small clearing. Max's behavior changed instantly. His tail began wagging furiously as he circled a specific area, pawing at the ground and whining with excitement. "He's found something," Claire said, kneeling beside her dog. The ground felt different here, more compact than the surrounding soil. Grace joined her, examining the earth. "We'd need shovels and proper tools to investigate properly, and maybe some help from others who supported us at the meeting." "We should mark this spot," Nancy suggested, pulling a bright ribbon from her pocket. She tied it to a nearby branch while Grace logged the location on her phone. The sun was beginning to set as they made their way back toward town, discussing their plans for tomorrow's dig. Claire felt a surge of hope as she listened to her friends plan who to call and what tools they'd need. "We should start early," Grace suggested, "before it gets too hot." "I'll bring my gardening spades," Nancy offered, "and I know a few others who might want to help." The early morning mist clung to the clearing as Claire and her team arrived with their equipment. Max circled the area excitedly, his nose working overtime at the spot he'd identified the day before. "Everyone ready?" Claire asked, gripping her shovel. Grace and Nancy nodded, and they began to dig. The work was harder than expected. Thick roots crisscrossed through the soil, requiring careful removal. Sweat beaded on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. After 2 hours of steady digging, Nancy's shovel hit something solid. "Hold on," she called out. "I found something." They cleared away more dirt, revealing a metal surface. Working together, they uncovered what appeared to be a small vault, about the size of a large trunk. Claire's hands trembled as she brushed away decades of accumulated soil, revealing an inscription. "Look here," Grace pointed. That's Calloway's signature, just like the one in his diary at the museum. With considerable effort, they managed to pry open the vault's heavy lid. Inside, protected by oilcloth wrapping, lay a collection of yellowed letters and documents. Claire carefully lifted out the first bundle, her heart racing as she unfolded the brittle paper. "These are Calloway's personal letters," she breathed, scanning the faded handwriting. "And look, there's a letter here about Thomas Whitman, Charles's great-grandfather." Grace leaned in close as Claire read aloud. "My dear friend Thomas has betrayed my trust in the most grievous way. He seeks to claim my wealth for himself, spreading lies among the townspeople." Nancy's face grew serious. So the Whitmans were behind Calloway's downfall? No wonder Charles is so opposed to this search. As they examined more documents, they found detailed records of Calloway's charitable works, lists of families he'd helped, homes he'd saved from foreclosure, and apprenticeships he'd funded. But mixed among these papers were references to another location, with cryptic notations about the true treasure. "There's more out there," Claire said, carefully repacking the documents. "This is just the beginning." They secured the documents in Grace's waterproof backpack, making sure everything was protected for the journey back to town. As they gathered their tools, Claire felt her heart racing, both from their success and from the knowledge that these revelations would only intensify the conflict with Charles Whitman. The morning sun streamed through the library's dusty windows as Claire pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Mrs. Collins looked up from her desk, her eyes brightening with interest. "I hoped you'd come by," Mrs. Collins said, gathering her reading glasses. "After hearing about the vault, I pulled some records that might help." They settled at a large oak table in the research room, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and yellowed documents. Mrs. Collins brought over several boxes of archived materials. "These contain property records and legal documents from Calloway's time," she explained, carefully lifting out brittle papers. Claire's fingers moved delicately through the documents, her eyes scanning dates and signatures. Hours passed as they methodically worked through the records. The quiet was broken only by the occasional rustle of paper and scratch of Claire's pen taking notes. "Wait," Claire said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. "Look at these land deeds." Mrs. Collins leaned in closer, adjusting her glasses. Two documents lay side by side, both for the same property, but with different signatures and dates. "The handwriting," Mrs. Collins murmured, reaching for a magnifying glass. "The second deed signature doesn't match Calloway's other documents." Claire's heart raced as they dug deeper. More forged documents emerged, all bearing the same false signature. Each one transferred portions of Calloway's land to Thomas Whitman, Charles's great-grandfather. "These prove it," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas Whitman systematically stole Calloway's property through forged documents. The Whitman family's wealth. It all came from betraying Calloway." Mrs. Collins carefully arranged the damning evidence in chronological order. These forgeries would have given Thomas Whitman control over most of Calloway's holdings. No wonder the family's so desperate to keep this buried. Claire gathered the documents with trembling hands, securing them in a protective folder. The weight of the truth felt heavy in her arms as she thanked Mrs. Collins and headed for the library door. She had what she needed to confront Charles Whitman at the next town meeting, though the thought filled her with both determination and dread. The community center buzzed with anticipation as Claire walked in, clutching her folder of evidence. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. She spotted Charles Whitman in the front row, his expression cold and calculating. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, and Claire approached the podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. "What I've found proves that Edward Calloway was betrayed by his business partner, Thomas Whitman," she began, her voice growing stronger. These documents show a pattern of forgery that transferred Calloway's land to the Whitman family. She held up the original deeds alongside the forged ones. Notice the signatures. Mrs. Collins and I discovered multiple instances where Thomas Whitman forged Calloway's signature to steal his property. Charles Whitman shot to his feet. This is absurd. She's fabricating lies to smear my family's good name. His face had turned red with anger. These so-called documents could easily be fakes. I can verify their authenticity. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her voice firm. The museum has samples of Calloway's genuine signature. The forgeries are clear when compared side by side. Mrs. Collins joined in, adjusting her glasses. The library's archives contain the original property records. The paper, ink, and dating all confirm Claire's findings. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several elderly residents nodded, pieces of old family stories suddenly making sense. My grandfather used to talk about Calloway's generosity, someone called out. He said the man was robbed of everything he built. Charles Whitman's face twisted with fury. You can't seriously believe this woman's wild accusations. She's nothing but a lonely widow desperate for attention. The crowd gasped at his cruel words. Claire felt her cheeks burn, but she stood her ground. Mr. Whitman, she said quietly, the evidence speaks for itself. Mayor Thompson called for order and proposed a vote to protect the excavation site and continue the search for Calloway's legacy. Hands rose throughout the room, forming a clear majority. Charles Whitman knocked over his chair as he stood. This isn't over, he snarled, storming toward the exit. I'll fight this with every legal means at my disposal. The door slammed behind him, leaving the community center in tense silence. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves as Claire stood before a crowd of eager volunteers. Nearly 30 people had shown up, armed with shovels, water bottles, and determination. She felt a wave of gratitude seeing familiar faces. Grace, Nancy, and even Mrs. Carter had come despite her age. Thank you all for being here, Claire said, spreading out the map on a portable table. According to these markings, we're looking for a spot about 2 miles northeast. Max wagged his tail, seeming to sense the excitement in the air. Grace handed out copies of the map she'd made, marking the tree carvings they'd discovered earlier. The group trudged through dense undergrowth, helping each other over fallen logs and through thorny patches. Claire's boots squelched in the mud as she followed Mac's confident lead. The dog would occasionally stop, sniff the air, and adjust their course. Look here, someone called out. Another tree carving appeared, matching the patterns they'd been following. The group's energy lifted with each discovered marking. After an hour of hiking, Max barked and bounded ahead into a clearing. Claire's breath caught as she saw what remained of a small structure, its wooden walls partially collapsed and covered in decades of vegetation. This has to be it, Grace said, squeezing Claire's shoulder. The location matches perfectly with the map. The volunteers spread out, carefully clearing away debris and roots. Some began digging where Max showed particular interest, his nose pressed to the ground as he pawed at the earth. Take it slowly, Claire cautioned. We don't want to damage anything that might be buried here. The sound of shovels cutting through soil filled the clearing. People worked in shifts, trading places when arms grew tired. Hours passed, marked only by the sun's movement overhead and the growing pile of excavated earth. As evening approached, a shovel struck something solid. The hollow thunk made everyone freeze. Claire's heart raced as more dirt was carefully cleared away, revealing the curved top of a large wooden chest. It took 6 people to carefully lift it from its earthen bed. The chest's dark wood was weathered but intact, its brass fittings dulled with age. An ornate lock, exactly as described in Calloway's diary, held it firmly closed. Claire brushed away decades of dirt with trembling fingers, revealing intricate carvings along the lid that matched the patterns they'd followed through the woods. Max sat beside her, his tail sweeping the ground as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. She reached for the key in her pocket, the same one Max had found that seemed so long ago now. The metal felt warm in her palm as she held it up to the lock. The flashlight beam trembled in Claire's hand as she knelt before the mud-streaked chest. The key slid into the lock, the same key that had started this journey weeks ago when Max found it in the woods. With a deep breath, she turned it. The mechanism clicked and the lid creaked open. Gas rippled through the gathered crowd. Inside, stacks of gold coins gleamed in the dying light. Beautifully crafted blacksmith's tools lay carefully wrapped in oilcloth, their handles bearing Callaway's distinctive maker's mark. But what caught Claire's eye was an envelope, sealed with wax, resting atop everything. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter and began to read aloud. To the people of Pinewood Hollow. If you are reading this, you have found what I hoped would one day be discovered by those who understand its true worth. The gold here represents my life's work, but the real treasure lies in what it can accomplish. I have watched our town grow, seen both its beauty and its divisions. My deepest wish is that this wealth be used to bring people together, to help those in need, and to remind everyone that we are stronger when we stand as one community. The tools I crafted represent honest work and the dignity it brings. Let them serve as a reminder that every person's contribution matters, regardless of their station in life. Use these resources wisely. Let them build bridges where there are walls, create opportunity where there is hardship, and foster unity where there is division. With hope for our future, Edward Callaway. Claire's voice cracked as she finished reading. Looking up, she saw tears in Grace's eyes, mirroring her own. The gathered townspeople stood in respectful silence, the weight of Callaway's words settling over them. All this time, Nancy whispered, he wasn't just hiding wealth. He was protecting a dream for our town. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. How greed and betrayal had nearly destroyed Callaway's vision. How similar tensions still divided their community today. The golden coins gleamed in the flashlight beam, but it was the letter's message that truly captured everyone's attention. Grace stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the chest. Maybe this is our chance, she said softly, to finally make things right. As they carefully packed everything to transport back to town, Claire noticed how people who had barely spoken to each other before were now working together, sharing stories about their own family histories in Pinewood Hollow. The chest had already begun its work of bringing people together, just as Callaway had hoped. Sunlight streamed through Claire's dining room windows, casting a warm glow on the weathered chest that now commanded center stage on her oak table. Max lounged nearby, his tail thumping contentedly against the floor as Claire welcomed Grace, Nancy, and Mrs. Carter into her home. It still feels surreal, Grace said, running her fingers along the chest's ancient wood. To think Max led us to all of this. Claire poured coffee for everyone, the familiar aroma mixing with the musty scent of old metal and wood. I've been thinking about what Callaway would want us to do with this treasure, she said, settling into her chair. His letter made it clear. He wanted this to benefit everyone in Pinewood Hollow. What did you have in mind? Mrs. Carter asked, her eyes bright with interest. Claire took a deep breath. I think we should build a community center, a place dedicated to education, inclusion, and bringing people together. Everything Callaway stood for. Grace's face lit up. That's perfect. We could have classrooms, meeting spaces, maybe even a small museum section about Callaway's legacy. Nancy stirred her coffee slowly, her expression cautious. Charles Whitman won't like this. He and his supporters will fight it every step of the way." "She's right," Mrs. Carter added. "We'll need to consider funding beyond just the treasure, permits, land purchase." "But think about what it could mean for Pinewood Hollow," Claire insisted, her voice gaining strength. "A place where everyone feels welcome, where we can heal these old divisions. Isn't that worth fighting for?" Grace reached over and squeezed Claire's hand. "I'm with you all the way." "We should present it at the next town meeting," Mrs. Carter suggested. "Get ahead of any opposition with a solid proposal." Nancy nodded slowly. "If we're thorough in our planning, show them exactly how it benefits the whole community, it might work." As they discussed logistics and potential challenges, Claire felt the spark of determination growing stronger. This was bigger than just finding a treasure. It was about fulfilling Callaway's vision for a united community. When her friends finally departed, Claire stood alone by the chest. Max padded over and pressed against her leg, looking up at her with devoted brown eyes. She scratched behind his ears, remembering that autumn morning when he'd found the key. "Look how far we've come, boy," she whispered, "and we're not done yet." Claire sat at her desk early that morning, sunlight warming her shoulders as she carefully chose her words. Max dozed nearby while she typed out her letter to the town, explaining how Callaway's treasure represented more than just material wealth. It was a chance for healing and unity. "Dear Pinewood Hollow," she wrote, "the chest we discovered contains not just gold, but a vision for our community's future. Edward Callaway dreamed of a town where everyone could thrive together. I propose we honor his wish by building a community center, a place where all residents can gather, learn, and grow stronger as one." Within hours of the letter appearing in the Pinewood Herald, the town buzzed with conversation. At the local diner, Claire overheard heated debates over coffee cups. "It's exactly what this town needs," said Mrs. Peterson, the kindergarten teacher. "A place for everyone." But at the hardware store, Charles Whitman held court with his supporters. "This is a misuse of historical artifacts," he declared. "That treasure belongs in a museum, not funding some feel-good project." Claire spent her afternoon walking Main Street, stepping into shops and offices. At the elementary school, Principal Roberts listened intently as she shared Callaway's letter. "This could give our students so many opportunities," he said, examining the carefully preserved paper. "You have my full support." At the First Methodist Church, Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully as Claire explained her vision. "A place of learning and unity. That's something we can all get behind," he said, adding his name to her growing list of supporters. But not every door opened warmly. At the bank, Whitman's allies refused to even discuss the proposal. "The Whitman family built this town," the bank manager said stiffly. "Some people seem to have forgotten that." By evening, Claire's voice was hoarse from talking, her feet aching from walking. She settled into her favorite armchair at home, Max resting his head on her lap. The day's conversations replayed in her mind. The excitement in Principal Roberts' eyes, Pastor Williams' warm endorsement, but also the cold shoulders and whispered criticisms. Max looked up at her with devoted brown eyes, and Claire scratched behind his ears. "We're making progress," she whispered, watching the sunset paint her living room in shades of orange and gold. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a flutter of hope in her chest. The community center wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming a possibility. The community center's meeting hall hummed with tension as residents filed in, filling every seat and lining the walls. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she arranged her documents on the podium, but her voice remained steady when she began to speak. "Edward Callaway believed in bringing people together," she said, holding up his weathered letter. "This community center can fulfill his vision, a place where children can learn, where neighbors can gather, where everyone belongs." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd as Claire outlined her plans. The center would offer after-school programs, adult education classes, and meeting spaces for local groups. She explained how the Treasure's funds could support construction and ongoing operations. Just as heads began nodding in agreement, Charles Whitman stood up, his expensive suit stark against the casual attire of other attendees. "I have something to say," he announced, pulling papers from his briefcase. "I've filed a legal injunction. That treasure, and the land it was found on, legally belongs to the Whitman family." The room erupted. "That's ridiculous," someone shouted. "Let Claire finish," called another voice. Claire raised her hand for quiet, maintaining her composure. "I expected this," she said calmly, retrieving the documents she'd discovered at the library. "These records show how Mr. Whitman's ancestor forged land ownership papers to steal from Callaway. The treasure was found on what was rightfully Callaway's property." She passed the evidence to Mrs. Carter, who began explaining the historical significance of the documents. The crowd leaned in, studying the proof of the century-old deception. "This doesn't change anything," Whitman declared, his face reddening. "I'll see you in court." "The court can review these documents, too," Claire responded firmly, along with Callaway's letter stating his clear intentions for this treasure to benefit the entire community. More voices joined in support of Claire. The mayor called for order, suggesting a preliminary vote on the community center proposal. Hands rose throughout the room, overwhelmingly in favor of moving forward despite Whitman's threats. As the meeting adjourned, residents gathered around Claire. "We're with you," Grace assured her, squeezing her hand. "Whitman can't stop what's right for the town." Claire smiled, exhausted but encouraged. The stack of supportive signatures in front of her proved that Callaway's dream of unity was already taking root. The old forge site buzzed with activity as volunteers gathered early Monday morning. Claire watched from beside a weathered stone wall as pickup trucks loaded with lumber and supplies rolled in. The autumn sun caught the morning dew, making the grass sparkle. "We've got quite a crew today," Grace said, setting up folding tables for the lunch station. The aroma of coffee and fresh pastries drew workers over between tasks. Nancy moved through the crowd with her clipboard, checking off donations as they arrived. "The Henderson family just dropped off another load of lumber," she called out, "and the Miller brothers are bringing their concrete mixer this afternoon." Claire's heart swelled as she watched former rivals working side by side. Tom Peterson, who had stood firmly with Whitman at the town meeting, now helped measure foundation lines with Sarah Jenkins, whose family had supported Claire from the start. "It's amazing what people can do when they work together," Grace said, handing out sandwiches to the hungry volunteers. Max trotted between groups of workers, tail wagging, accepting pets and treats. He'd become the unofficial site mascot, bringing smiles to tired faces and helping break the ice between newcomers. "Who would have thought we'd see the day?" Nancy mused, watching Robert Thompson, another former Whitman supporter, teaching teenagers how to properly mix cement. These kids are learning more than just construction skills. The foundation began taking shape as the day progressed. Claire walked the perimeter, checking plans and answering questions. Every few steps, someone would stop her to share an idea or story about what the center would mean to them. "My grandmother used to tell me about coming to the forge with her father," elderly Mrs. Peterson said, her eyes misty. "She'd be so proud to see it becoming something special again." By late afternoon, the foundation's outline was clearly visible. Claire stood at the edge of the site, Max at her side, watching volunteers clean up for the day. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground where Callaway's forge once stood, now transformed by the community's shared purpose. The sound of laughter and friendly conversation filled the air as people gathered their tools. Grace's lunch station had become an impromptu meeting spot where workers lingered, sharing stories and making plans for the next day's tasks. We're off to a good start, Nancy said, joining Claire. Who knew an old key could unlock so much more than just a chest? The town square hummed with excitement as residents gathered for the Callaway Legacy Festival. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed overhead, and autumn leaves danced in the gentle breeze. Historical photos of the old forge lined the square, showing Edward Callaway at work, his kind eyes and determined expression captured in sepia tones. It's like the whole town showed up, Grace said, adjusting a banner that read, United in Callaway's Vision. The aroma of fresh apple pies and grilled corn wafted through the air as vendors set up their stalls. Nancy bustled about, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers. The face painting booth goes next to the blacksmith demonstration, she called out. And don't forget to leave space for the children's craft area. Claire watched in amazement as former adversaries chatted and laughed together. Old Mr. Thompson, who had initially opposed the community center, now demonstrated traditional forging techniques to wide-eyed children. His weathered hands shaped metal as he shared stories about Callaway's craftsmanship. Max trotted through the crowd, his tail wagging as children rushed to pet him. There's the hero who found the key, people called out as he passed. He seemed to understand his celebrity status, pausing patiently for photos and offering his paw to young admirers. When it came time for Claire's speech, she stood at the podium, her heart full. A few months ago, this town was divided, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. But Edward Callaway left us more than just a treasure chest. He left us a reminder that true wealth lies in how we treat each other. She gestured to the construction site visible in the distance. That community center isn't just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together. Callaway knew that unity was more precious than gold, and now we understand why. Even Robert Whitman's cousin Sarah approached Claire after the speech. I was wrong about you, she admitted quietly. What you're doing here, it's exactly what this town needed. The festival buzzed with activity as families played games, shared meals, and explored craft booths. Children gathered around a storytelling corner where Mrs. Carter shared tales of old Pinewood Hollow. The sound of laughter and friendly conversation filled the square. Max had found his place at the children's craft table, where young artists decorated paper dog masks in his honor. He sat regally, as if posing for his admirers, occasionally stealing gentle licks from small hands that reached to scratch his ears. As evening approached, the crowd gathered for the fireworks display. Claire stood with Grace and Nancy, watching the colorful bursts illuminate the faces of her neighbors. Faces that now showed hope and joy instead of suspicion and division. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the newly laid walkway leading to the community center. What was once a dilapidated forge now stood proud and welcoming, its red brick exterior restored to its former glory, while modern touches like large windows and solar panels pointed toward the future. Claire walked through the main entrance, running her hand along the smooth wooden handrail. The scent of fresh paint and new carpeting filled the air. Workers mounted the last of the light fixtures while others carefully installed display cases in the main hall. It's really coming together, Grace said, joining Claire. They watched as two craftsmen carefully positioned Callaway's letter in a custom-built display case. The weathered paper, now properly preserved, would serve as the centerpiece of the main hall's historical exhibition. We should have a proper celebration, Grace continued, her eyes bright with excitement. Something to mark this moment for future generations. Nancy appeared with her ever-present clipboard, already jotting down ideas. A ribbon-cutting ceremony would be perfect. We could invite the whole town, have speeches, music. She paused, looking up. Maybe even demonstrate some traditional blacksmithing techniques in honor of Callaway? Claire nodded, watching as more residents gathered outside the building's large windows, pointing and smiling. Even those who had initially sided with Whitman now seemed drawn to the center's promise. "Look at that craftsmanship," old Mr. Peterson remarked loudly enough to be heard inside. He had been one of Whitman's strongest supporters, but now he beamed with pride. "They don't build things like this anymore." Max lay near the entrance, his tail thumping against the floor as children stopped to pet him on their way to peek inside. The dog seemed to understand his role in the center's story, greeting each visitor with dignified enthusiasm. "We could display the key, too," Grace suggested, gesturing to an empty case near Calloway's letter. "After all, that's what started this whole journey." Claire reached into her pocket, where she still carried the key, its weathered surface now familiar to her touch. She remembered that morning in the woods when Max had first discovered it, how uncertain she'd felt then. Now, looking around at the bustling activity and feeling the community's excitement, those doubts seemed far away. Nancy consulted her notes. "I've already got 15 volunteers signed up to help with the opening ceremony, and more calling every hour. People really want to be part of this." Through the windows, Claire could see families gathering on the newly sodded lawn. Children chased each other while parents chatted, the space already becoming a natural meeting point for the community. The center hadn't officially opened yet, but it was already fulfilling its purpose, bringing people together. Claire stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a warm glow over the center and the gathered townspeople. Her heart swelled with gratitude and accomplishment, knowing that Calloway's vision for unity had finally been realized. The morning sun painted the new community center in a warm golden light. Rows of white chairs filled the courtyard, now packed with excited residents. Local reporters positioned their cameras while children clutched small flags bearing the center's logo, a blacksmith's hammer intertwined with an olive branch. Claire stood behind the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her note cards. Max sat dutifully beside her, his tail wagging as he watched the crowd. The red ribbon fluttered in the gentle breeze, a symbol of all they'd accomplished. "When Max found that key in the woods," Claire began, her voice steady and clear, "I never imagined it would lead us here. Edward Calloway left us more than just treasure. He left us a vision of what our community could be." She gestured to the building behind her. "This center represents that vision. It's a place where everyone belongs, where we can learn from our past and build a better future together. The real treasure wasn't the gold we found. It was discovering how strong we are when we work as one." Tears glistened in many eyes as Claire spoke. Even some of Whitman's former supporters nodded in agreement. Grace and Nancy stood nearby, their faces beaming with pride. After the applause died down, Claire lifted the ceremonial scissors. "Let's open these doors together," she announced, cutting the ribbon to thunderous cheers. People streamed into the main hall, their gasps of appreciation echoing off the walls. Mrs. Carter stood by the historical displays, explaining the significance of Calloway's tools and letters to interested visitors. Children pressed their faces against the glass cases, fascinated by the preserved artifacts. "Look at this," Grace whispered to Claire, pointing to a group of elderly residents sharing stories with teenagers about the town's history. "This is exactly what Calloway wanted. Generations connecting, learning from each other." Nancy approached them, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "I was wrong to doubt this project," she admitted. "This place is already bringing people together." As the crowd explored the building, Claire found a quiet moment to stand in the main hall. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating Calloway's letter in its display case. She felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, knowing his legacy would continue to inspire future generations. The community center buzzed with life as children's laughter echoed through its halls. Claire watched from the doorway of her newly opened art gallery as a group of students hurried past, their backpacks bouncing, heading to the after-school art program she'd started last month. Her latest painting caught the afternoon light, a striking scene of Calloway's Forge, reimagined in vibrant colors. Beside it hung a series depicting the town's journey from division to unity, each canvas telling part of the story that had brought them all together. "These just keep getting better and better," Grace said, stepping into the gallery. She carried a stack of flyers for next week's community workshop. "The one of Max finding the key is my favorite." Claire smiled, touching the frame of that particular painting. "He still tries to dig up treasures every time we walk in the woods." Nancy appeared in the doorway, her arms full of donated art supplies. 3 more families signed up for the weekend classes, she announced proudly. "And you won't believe who I just saw making a donation at the front desk. Charles Whitman himself." Claire raised her eyebrows in surprise. The last few months had shown subtle changes in Whitman's attitude. He'd stopped opposing the center's initiatives, and occasionally she'd spot him watching the children play in the new playground, a thoughtful expression on his face. The main hall bustled with activity. A group of seniors gathered around card tables, dealing hands and sharing stories. In the reading corner, volunteers helped young children with their homework. The walls, once bare, now displayed photographs of the town's history alongside children's artwork. "Remember when we thought this might never happen?" Grace asked softly, watching a young boy show his grandmother how to use one of the center's computers. Claire nodded, thinking back to those tense town meetings and uncertain days. Now the center had become the heart of Pinewood Hollow, bringing together people from all walks of life. Every day she witnessed small moments of connection and kindness that would have made Calloway proud. Max lounged near the gallery entrance, accepting gentle pats from passing visitors. He'd become the center's unofficial mascot, and children often brought him treats, much to his delight. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Claire gathered her things, ready to head home. Max trotted beside her through the bustling halls, past the wall where Calloway's letter hung in a place of honor. Outside, the autumn air carried the same crispness it had on that fateful morning when Max had found the key. They walked their familiar path home, leaves crunching beneath their feet. Claire felt a deep sense of peace settle over her as she looked back at the warmly lit windows of the community center. If you enjoyed the story of Claire, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.